Welcome to the Robert and Francis Fullerton Museum of Art's Art Hour podcast, where we talk about art, history, and everything in between. I'm your host, Lana, and today we will be talking to Chase and Diego about craftsmanship and artistry and the differences and similarities between them. So hi guys, thank you. I'm going to introduce you guys real quick. We'll start with Diego since you're the closest to the camera. Diego is a CSUSB alumni and Raffma staff, and your title is Education and Collections Coordinator. We also have Chase, who's a fellow student assistant, a senior, and is studio art and art history double major, if I have that correct.
Yep.
And then I think you mentioned a minor in history too?
Yeah, and I have a minor in history now.
Busy, yeah. And you might notice we are not on Zoom anymore. We're actually in person in the museum, which is kind of fun. We have a nice fancy table set up. So yeah, we're going to be doing this all now in person. So I guess we can just go ahead and get started. Maybe Chase, you kind of have that background of actually making it. Well, both of you guys do. I think you had some experience with making art too. Maybe we could talk about I think we should start with definitions first. I think it's going to be harder to define an artist. But how would you define like a craftsperson, or what is it to be, skilled in craft, if that's a thing?
I think at the very beginning, there's a difference between making things that are supposed to be the same and making things that aren't supposed to be the same to each other. If you're most consumer goods nowadays, you want them to be as similar to each other as possible. That's a lot of today's manufacturing style, today's goods style, shipping, the way you order things on Amazon. When you order something on Amazon, you want it to be the same as every other thing in that category. So I think what we'd call a craftsman is somebody who's makes something that shouldn't be the exact same as every other copy of it, where one thing he makes is at the very least a little bit different from the next thing that they make. And once you look at it in that definition, you expand that to a lot beyond just art, which is why I think it's a good definition for craftspeople in general, because there are a lot of crafts and things that are made by craftspeople that aren't necessarily art.
Right. And what do you think about that definition, Diego? Would you agree, disagree?
I do like it. There's a human element, right, to the word craftsmanship, that somebody has put this together by hand. And like you said, there's some variety between the products that person is making, rather than it being coming off of a conveyor belt, for example, and it all being identical to the previous one. So I'm okay with that definition in general. I think it's interesting that we would look at something that is made and we would say that that's good craftsmanship, right? So in that sense, is it the same definition, do you think? Right? Why would we use it that way?
We do seem to have some kind of adjective form, some kind of objective or subjective standard of craftsmanship, some craftiness, some kind of craftiness quality that we can identify in things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For me, I've always seen it, and I don't know if you guys would agree with this or not, I've always seen it as just like the skill to be able to do things with your hands. So that can vary from, maybe like someone making baskets or someone making pottery, for example, or even maybe like a skill like being a baker or maybe being a mechanic. So being crafty is, the ability to do things with your hands. Or do you guys think that's too broad of a definition?
So we go, I think it doesn't take a lot to break that definition, because you go a little bit, you stretch that just a little bit, and you can say, so are 3D modelers for computer art craftspeople then, because they're not necessarily making an object with their hands. They're using their hands to make an object indirectly. It still shows, there's still that craftiness element. There's some kind of craftspersonship element in there. We can definitely see that. And then if we say that, okay, that's a craftsperson, then what about somebody who codes for that same game? There's an individualistic element. Every line of their code is going to be custom to that thing. It very well could be a work of art to other coders when they look at it, but they're not doing anything with their hands. So would you say somebody designing virtual art like that is a craftsperson?
That's a tricky question, because like in my head I would say like, you do things with computers, that's a different skill than, using like handheld tools, doing things manually. But I guess you kind of use a computer manually. I don't know. We're getting in foggy definitions, but I mean, we kind of sort of have a baseline understanding of maybe what a craftsperson is or not. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. And so there's this Italian artist, I hope I'm not pronouncing his name wrong, Salvator Garao, I think. I looked it up right before, but I already forgot. So it's an Italian artist And he made a sculpture that sold for $18,300. That's a significant amount for a piece of art.
Yeah.
The catch is that it's an invisible sculpture. So when you're actually displaying the piece, there is nothing there. And so the artist basically said, and this is a quote from the artist, "It is a work that asks you to activate the power of the imagination." So you're supposed to imagine what you would want to see there. Now, a lot of people would say, okay, how is that art? You're literally selling nothing. It might even be a scam because, I mean, really all you're selling is a piece of paper for the certificate of authenticity.
But that is the thing, is he did not just walk into a gallery and say, "Look at my work of art." He showed it through a gallery exhibition space. He has all the paperwork in line for any proper work of art that's been sold to such a space that can sell its art. He has instructions for how to display it, and they're very specific and precise instructions. He says, this is the size of the enclosure. You can't have anything in it. It needs to be in a certain way, and you have to display this in a certain way. And then you put the object in there. The hard part's putting the object into the display area because there's no object.
Right. So would you guys say that this artist, and this artist has multiple pieces like this. I think one is Buddha in Contemplation is one that he did right before this, where there actually is something. It's an outline on the ground of where it should be, but still nothing physical occupying the space. So would you guys consider this person a craftsperson?
He's very crafty in the sense that I think he's learned about the fine art world enough and understood it enough to, I think, in a way, be very manipulative and persuasive in what he would like to do. When I was in art school, seeing things like this and performance art was kind of coming about. I was always thinking about, okay, what's the way that I could create something that had the most validation on one end, but on the other end involved the least amount of work. And he's probably perfected that in his career. It sure seems like he has.
$18,300 on the piece, so I'd say that's
right.
Pretty successful.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say that it's craftsmanship per se. I mean, unless you start to include the ability to persuade somebody. And it could be that he's had a reputation already. So
right.
you're buying essentially.
You wouldn't buy it unless the fact that they got to it in the first place, that they know this artist, is because somebody along the way somewhere is buying into this. Somebody does agree and think about these philosophies and say, yeah, I'm willing to spend $20,000 on it. Somebody is putting that much money on the line for this, saying they believe in it.
In one way, too, you're not paying for the piece. You're not paying to have the piece in your house or in your museum or your gallery. What you're doing is you're supporting the artist's endeavors.
True.
So, and I think it becomes really obvious in general when we buy work from artists. A lot of times, maybe the physicality of the thing is not even worth what you're going to pay for it, but you're willing to pay that because you're supporting the individual who's producing the work, and that you think that individual's worth that, essentially.
That's a really good point, because beyond that, everything in this interaction is still there. It's just missing the art. So the artist went to an exhibition, set up an exhibition, showed his art. People saw the art. People experienced the art. People thought about the art. People drew the conclusion he wanted them to. You know, the point of the piece is he's making fun of the art scene and what we consider art. And what do we do when we see it? We go, isn't that funny? He's right.
Yeah.
We say he's right.
Yeah. Well, the question is was the object ever the art in the first place?
Yeah. But my point is, it succeeded at doing everything but being an art. There's this story that hits the media where we talk about the artist and the buyer, and now we know all about them. Any art, when it's sold, is a form of marketing like that, and it succeeded at that form of marketing for the artist and for the buyer. I think every single part of the art showing off and transaction is there and is successful. It's just that there is no art.
I would disagree with you. I don't think the art is what's missing. What's missing is the object. So often we associate art with an object, but I don't think, and I've kind of done this for a long time with what I try to do in the art world, at least in the fine art world, is a lot of times there's no object. And I think that's interesting because what I've come to the conclusion is that the actual art experience is the engagement. So that moment between somebody and something else, right? So maybe the art is the experience that the people have, and maybe the shock and awe that they would have when you realize that there's nothing in here, or maybe it's the imagination that maybe it really is there, but you can't see it, right? So that experience that you trying to figure out where it is, or maybe it's just hidden in a corner here, or that interaction that you might have, that's actually the art. And maybe forcing people to have that experience is the actual art form, right? I think that's interesting concept, but like how it ties into craftsmanship, I don't think that
It does. Okay.
like as far as like the object is concerned, because a
Right.
lot of times we concern ourselves with the object as far as craftsmanship. His craftsmanship is behind the scenes. It's the convincing of the public essentially
Right.
that this is legitimate.
And in this discussion, one thing that comes to mind is Marcel Duchamp. I'm tying a lot of similarities with his. I'm forgetting the name of it. It's the urinal.
Yeah, the
The
ready-mades.
fountain.
Yeah, the
yeah,
fountain.
The fountain. Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of similarities because everyone would agree that Marcel Duchamp was a great artist. He was definitely controversial at the time because he was taking things that already existed and then just putting his name on it and stuff like that was art. But I am seeing like a lot of similarities. So just like a point of similarity, would you guys say that artists would need to have the craftsmanship skill? Because that was definitely a thing in the past. Like when you were an artist, like let's say of the Renaissance. I mean, there's definitely that level of being skilled in painting or sculpture, and it took years of apprenticeship and really learning the ropes and things like that before you're able to be your own artist that can put your name out there. Would you guys say that element is gone now?
I think it's evolved. So back then, the patrons of the art were looking for something specific. So the names that we know today are the ones that were able to fulfill the needs of the patrons. And today, the needs of the patrons have changed quite a bit, and also the relationship between artist and patron is very different. So an artist can work a patron to support any idea they might have, based on that kind of relationship and friendship and maybe respect that they might have between each other. Where back then, the role of the artist was very different in relation to the patron, which was a lot of time the church or the state in some way. And if they wanted something that was grand and glorious and required a lot of craftsmanship, only the artist that had that would remain.
That's an interesting point. So in the past, you'd say like the patron would be maybe a rich person, the church, some institution of some sort, or someone who had a lot of money. Who would be the patron of today's society then?
Well, today I think wealth has been distributed in such a way that you can have a lot of independent people that have a lot of money and are willing to spend it, a lot of times for tax purposes, but at the same time they're willing to support an artist in whatever idea they might have. And knowing a little bit about how artists today fund themselves, a lot of them are seeking patrons. They're actively going out and talking to people and pitching themselves. And it's not so much a relationship like I'm making something for you, but rather you're funding something that I'm doing and you can be a part of that journey with me. And I think that's how a lot of artists who are monetarily independent are doing it. Even if they're not big names, there's a lot of artists that are doing that.
There's, especially today, there are many, many, many different patrons you can target. There's so many different audiences you can target. You can make your art for the public as a whole. You can make your art for the public of an area or for a country or for a region, whether physical or cybernetic, on Twitter or whatever. Or you could make your art for some specific market, for a classical patron, for rich people, for a museum, an exhibition, an auction house, a gallery. And I wonder, who is the audience then for Salvator Garao's work? Is the audience the person who bought it, or is the audience us reading the story afterwards?
Right. And Diego, you mentioned, the art is, the reaction that we get from the public. Like people are reading the story of this artist selling an invisible sculpture to this person. So maybe, like you said, the patron isn't the person who bought it, but it's the public. And in that sense, what comes into my mind is almost a form of capitalism. That seems to be apparent throughout all of history. It's you have a skill or you have an object, or you have something, and you sell it to the market, and the market is what changes and what kind of dictates, what you produce, and whatever the market wants, if you produce it, that's how you become successful. And it's interesting because I feel like a lot of artists nowadays are very anti-capitalist. Like we don't
But
get
they're
like
the most in action.
Exactly. So
Necessarily,
it seems
art
like
in 2021 is so capitalistic. You're constantly marketing yourself, building a brand around yourself, advertising around yourself, being a corporation into yourself.
So it's interesting to think that, at least like when you see artists, I believe Picasso was like this, or Frida Kahlo was like this too, were very anti-capitalist, very pro socialist policies. So why do you think that is, that there's such a discrepancy between, what their personal views are, whatever they're practicing, and how they produce their art? Because they are producing art in a very capitalistic manner.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would say so. I think academia in general has a lot to do with that. Like the idea of socialism is perfected in the mind and rarely in practice. So I think that is, and art has become a very academic thing in general, and it perhaps was so in the past, but it wasn't so intimately tied into the institutions of academia the way it is today. I think a lot of what we're seeing, like especially with Salvator, we're moving further and further away from the physical object and like further into the mind, simply because of us wanting to almost elevate what we're doing as artists. I think that's kind of like an interesting, if you look at the way it's evolved historically, it seems to be progressing in that way. I don't know if socialists in general all believe in fine art like the way that Picasso would.
One of the first things they did in the Russian Revolution is say no more fine artists, because artists are bourgeois and capitalist inherently.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's a whole art movement, Russian objectivism, where they tried to say no more artists, only craftspeople doing craft art.
Right. Yeah. There's it's like a walking contradiction in some ways, or very paradoxical, right? That like the two could exist in harmony, but they can intellectually, if you know what I mean, rather than in practice, but just kind of like mentally you can see the idea playing out, oh, this might work out well, where history hasn't really conveyed that necessarily.
Mm-hmm. And at least now I'm turning to the general public. So we kind of established, the mindset of the craft people and like maybe the patron. Maybe the public is the patron or not, we don't know. It's hard to tell. It seems like a lot of the public, though, is kind of definitely the shock value, but maybe not appreciative of, the art that's being produced today. Like when you go into a museum, maybe someone would say like, what is this? Why is this art? I could have done this in a day in my garage by myself. So what do you guys think of that maybe like the public isn't a fan of art nowadays? Or do you guys think that the public is really like eating this up? Like, oh, this is great.
This is the topic for me, as I'm the artist who does the technical things, works with my hands. There's a lot of talk and debate in art over how much do we value conceptual versus how much you can pull off. There's always a tension between, I see what you're going for and you nearly did it, but that's just not physically possible, or you're just not physically, or you're just not financially possible to make this come together, versus do what you can do and make it perfect. And like, I know in ceramics, like there's kind of this drama where people are afraid to criticize each other because they're seen as bringing everything down, and everybody just wants to say, I see what you're going for, this is good, you go. So there's almost this tension nowadays where we want to overlook the craftsperson factor. We want to look at just the artistic factor and not look at that. It's very, very much an active debate in academic and in practical circles over where's the role of skill versus concept.
Yeah, I think it kind of ties back into this idea of academia evolving the art form, and I think because it's within this realm of intellectual merit, they're working hard to raise the intellectual merit of fine art. And by doing so, you create divisions between the laymen. And it becomes a classist issue, essentially. You're creating a class of people that can find the value in something because they've been informed to do so, versus a public that maybe has not been informed to do so in the same way, or gone through the rigors of understanding something conceptually or intellectually in the same way. I think that's detrimental in general to the world of art, because it creates divisions. And like what we were talking about with the invisible sculpture, it's not about the object, it's about the relationship that you have with the public viewing it. And so in many ways, it seems like they're creating an art form that creates a reaction or an interaction that is negative. And that maybe that's what they're going after, right? That's what they want to have. maybe the shock value, right? And there's a lot of work that's made with the intention of having, I think, a negative reaction to certain groups or specific groups or whatever it may be. I don't think that serves either party, and maybe it benefits one end, right, to have that. But I think that's kind of like a negative approach. I wouldn't promote that approach personally, and I wouldn't seek that in my own work. I try to create a positive interaction with the public, or with anybody that were to interact with my work,
Right.
personally.
So it seems like the art really depends on your intended audience. So it seems like with these pieces where people are saying like, what is this? I could have done it in a day. It seems like the target audience is someone who can have more of that. I don't want to say meta thinking, but definitely more of like a educated thinking. I mean, that sounds terrible.
Like
but
an informed background.
informed,
Yes.
yeah.
The difference between layman's and informed, the difference between not enfranchised and enfranchised observers is like always number one to ever think about for anything ever. And especially in art, where there's such a huge gap, as you said, a gap that increases all the time with, as our technology, as our skill, as our culture, as our academics all push up and up and up over time, it only increases that gulf between enfranchisement and not being there.
I would say, as seeing a lot of work that's come here through the last, I've been around for over 10 years now. So I've seen the shows, and I've always valued the work, because as an artist, you make things that tries to draw people in and to
Right.
stick around longer. And, the question is, like, how can I make people engage with the work for longer periods of time rather than doing the stroll through the gallery where everything gets a blink and that's it. I find that the most valuable work is the one that's aesthetically interesting, that draws you in, and perhaps you don't capture the meaning of it immediately, but you're there long enough to start discover little things about it. And I touring groups, especially a lot of times young school kids that don't know much or aren't coming with that informed background, you can tell which works are successful almost immediately because they're drawn to them aesthetically. And by lingering, they can learn more about it and have a greater interaction, right? Experience more of that art. So I always value that first. And then if the artist has something to say about their work, I think it's always secondary, because if you're not going to live next to it and explain it to each and every person that comes by, if the work isn't saying it on its own, I think you've failed in your own intention, right? That's just how I see it. I mean, maybe it's a bit.
It's a simple fact of life. Everybody has a first impression, and the first impression is separate from the second impression. Like,
Right.
I don't think there's any way to bypass that. I don't think that's inherently a bad or a good thing. Everybody will always have a first impression on everything, and that'll always be separate from the intended purpose or thought. And I think that's something to use and lean into and to manipulate when making art, not to try to counterbalance it or offset it by overeducating people.
And perhaps that's the craftsmanship, like the craft of drawing people in, because it's a
Right.
visual language. If you have to verbally explain it, then you're now stepping out of the boundaries that is the visual fine art world, right?
Interesting. So this brings me to Jeff Koons, and we've talked about him
I've been
before.
trying not to mention him this entire time. I'm
I
like,
want to mention him. It's definitely going to come up. A lot of critics kind of talk about how he has this thing that has that visual element that looks pleasing. People want to see it. You have a giant balloon animal. Like, people want to see that. It's shiny. It's colorful. There's a word that you would always use for it, kitsch.
Yeah.
Yeah, his work is very kitsch. At the same time, though, he has all these long explanations of, analyzing its meaning and things like that. So, at least some people, I don't know where you guys stand on this, would say that he's going too far in trying to see things in it that aren't there. Because if you're not getting it from the piece, then, that shows that, something's missing, that the piece isn't conveying what it's supposed to. So, do you think that there's kind of this level of analytics, I don't want to say analytics, but, this level of, concepts that goes too far?
I think, like with anything, you could take anything too far, if you wanted to. I think artists in general, especially the very successful ones, suffer the same thing that anyone with fame suffers from, and it's like this overinflated ego, and that, if you're given the time, you'd love to explain more what you're thinking about it, especially if you have the captivating audience to go on and on and on. You're going to take advantage of that. That's probably more of like a human problem than it is an art problem in general. But Yeah, that's what I think.
I
of-
know
of
if we
whether
want
or
to
not
take
you
this
go
longer
too
than
far.
40 minutes, we can.
Go for it.
Yeah, I've definitely made it clear in the past that I think in Jeff Koons' case there is too far of a gap between that first impression and between his message. I think he is not using both of those. I think he has one that's far, far, far more important to him, and I don't think it's the one that he's saying is the one more important to him.
Right.
And so I think it is important for a truly good work of art to bridge that in some way. I'm not saying every work of art needs to be accessible, but I'm saying I think you should have an idea of what you're getting into when you look at something. I don't think something should be, unless it's intentionally subverting itself, should be a complete tonal mismatch with what it's saying at 1st.
So it's like you can't go from point A to point C. You need to have that point B. Is kind of what you're saying? So we've talked about, having that first impression, which is the visual, and the second impression, which is, the concept. Does there always need to be that second impression, though? Because at least for me, like when I was still younger, I was like, oh, I can never be an artist because I just like making things that look pretty. I don't have a purpose or an explanation or a concept behind it. And I feel like a lot of artists, at least from the classes I've been in, definitely have that same sentiment. So do you think that there would always have to be that second impression?
To a lot of people, that is the difference between craft and art, is that craft doesn't have the second impression. It's just what you see of it. And so that certainly is very much a debated threshold there. Is the second impression important, necessary, good, bad? How do you feel about it? How do you think on it? Does it even exist in the first place? I don't know.
Interesting.
I think it stems also from the merit building that's been taking place for the last 100 years or so. Where before, if you saw a good piece of work, you knew it, right? And a lot of times it was due to the level of skill of the artist. In seeing the craftsmanship of the thing, you would know that is an incredible artist. And over time, we've emphasized other things, and a lot of it is this merit building. So artists, I think, especially in the graduate programs, are trained to talk about their work. That's mainly what grad school is about. It's not so much about refining your skills, it's about refining how you verbalize your work.
Even as a bachelor, like your final year isn't making your best work. It's putting together and showing people and talking about and writing about your best work. It's building your portfolio, not putting work into your portfolio.
Right. Yeah. And I think that is a degradation to what art is in general. Maybe it's too controversial to say, but I don't even know if art should be a degree. And most of the most successful artists in the world, a lot of them don't have degrees. And I'm not going to say the name of the college, but I've talked to some friends who are recruiters for colleges that have very high merit art programs, and a lot of the professors don't even have the degrees that the students are trying to get. And so, the question is whether or not it can be taught, and whether or not we're trying to force this to be taught in a way. But yeah, that's kind of like, I don't think the second impression is necessary. I think it's maybe been ingrained in a lot of artists through kind of like this merit building that's been going around the idea of whether or not art is a valuable thing. And I think going back to art being the relationship, it's not always solely the relationship between the public and the object. It's also the artist and the object. The process of making something is the art, right? So I think that may be where we should put more of an emphasis rather than kind of creating the merit around something.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I love ceramics so much. Is I'll walk into that studio and I'll see everybody clustered together, oohing and awing over something. And I'll go, what is it? What is it? And it's just like somebody's handle. And they're just like, it's such a pretty little handle. And I'm like, it is. Can I see it?
Yeah.
Right. It's definitely interesting. So earlier we mentioned that, there's definitely been a change in art, in the way that we kind of view art and interact with art from, let's say the Renaissance or, way back. I feel like Renaissance is like the default history period, so we're just going to keep referencing
Especially
that.
for art. Absolutely, yes.
Yes. So there definitely has been, a shift in art from then till now. And I feel like that shift has just kind of become exponential as we moved up to our contemporary time. So earlier we just discussed that it wasn't the presence of the patron that change because the patron has always been there and dictates what we want to see produced. So would it be appropriate to say that the thing that maybe changed is that second impression? Like back then in the Renaissance, was there ever that second impression, or was it just the visual? And as we moved forward, it seems like we're moving away from that first impression and more emphasis on the second impression. Would you say that that is maybe what dictated that shift?
I don't know.
Because there is, I mean, in the Renaissance, especially in like the early Renaissance, a lot of the focus was on technical skill and craftspersonship. Like the realism movement was all about realism. We're like, we don't want to over exaggerate things. We want to see how well we can paint them. And then after that, you get romanticism, which is, we forgot the artist along the way. We went too far into craftspersonship in the Renaissance. How about we get back into romanticizing and making things look muddy and blurry instead of overly detailed? These are debates. These are debates that have been going on in art for hundreds of years.
Even in the Renaissance, there's an iconography, though. There is that like informed view of the object as well, where so everything means a certain thing.
Even in the naturalism, in that realism, you're still playing to a specific visual language of these are naked bodies with specific shadows over their shoulders, over their poses. They always have these specific poses that they do, specific compositions. The stories that they pick from are their own language. Yeah. It still sends a message. It still has a second impression, though, even there.
I think, that has definitely evolved with it. I don't know if that would be the impetus for the changing of the arts. I think it's evolved alongside the change of the patron and the evolution of the patron and the independence of the artist as well. So, I wouldn't say that is the driving force, but it's definitely a part of it. It's evolving along with everything else.
Interesting. So now my question is like, we kind of mentioned that even if you don't see it, there is always that level of second impression. Like you said, like with the Renaissance, there was always symbolism, there was always motifs, and there were certain things that were always there that maybe you didn't see at first glance, especially with, I'm forgetting the name of the painting. It's the double portrait, the Arnolfini double portrait, for example. Like when you look at it, there's a bunch of stuff. It looks like a pretty picture, but then as you investigate more and more, you notice these symbolisms and things like that. So maybe there was always that second impression. So I guess maybe this could be my last question. We'll see what the response is. But is it possible to have art without that second impression?
I think so. I would say that yes, you can always get the opinion of the artist. It's like music, right? When you listen to music, you have an impression of it, and it's probably the impression that sticks with you throughout. But with anything, if you investigate further and further and further, that first impression is going to evolve into a second, a third, and a fourth. The question is whether or not the impression is provided by the artist, right? And I think that's really what you mean by second impression, right?
It's very a death of an author kind of topic here. Is all the time people read into things. Yeah, you can read anything you want into anything. You can generate a deeper meaning into anything. There are so many songs where the singer is like, I don't know, I was just putting words together. I'm glad this is your favorite song ever. And so it's very possible to make, I think it's on the viewer, not necessarily in the artist more, in that the viewer decides how much intellectual effort they're going to put into it. Am I just going to skim this over and see that it's pretty? Or am I going to think about it deeper, whether or not there's something intended to be thought about deeper?
Right. So the question is the impression of the artist necessary?
Yeah.
And I don't think so. I don't think it's a necessary thing, and I think the artist should be willing to let go of the object as they've concluded their work on it. Because now it is a thing that's going to live on its own, and it's going to be at the whim of whatever effort somebody is willing to have with that object. I see a problem is maybe with younger artists that they feel their impression or their opinion about the work is more important than the opinion someone else might have about it, and I think that is more harmful than helpful to the evolution of that individual artist. So I don't think it's a necessary thing. I think the work should live without it. But it's always interesting to know the opinion of the artist as well.
Right. So this brings to mind something that happened over summer during my painting class. So we were doing critiques, and one student brought up this piece, and like we all took turns kind of thinking what the meaning was, and making our own interpretations. And we went to ask the student who painted it, he mentioned like there isn't interpretation, there isn't anything. I just kind of did what I wanted. And then the painting professor, shout out to Brad Spence, he mentioned that maybe you didn't have an active, decision-making part of your brain saying, okay, I'm making this color choice because I want to have this reaction, and basically the point that he made was, even if it's not there, the subconscious is there, and maybe 5 years down the line, you'll see like, oh, I did have a purpose for this piece, and I did have intent, and I did have that kind of second impression. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, because somebody who went through an MFA program and is trained to talk about their work would naturally talk about their work fundamentally differently from somebody who trained themselves over the last 10 years in their garage. That is something interesting that, not everybody is going to be able to, nobody will put together their thoughts, formalize them, and tell people in the exact same way as even maybe they're thinking. They might not even be speaking it right to other people in the first place, depending on how well they're communicating it, depending on how they formulated these thoughts, if they're communicable thoughts in the first place. There's definitely potential for meaning in art that isn't necessarily spoken of or possible to speak of.
Right. So it seems like, we mentioned that the second impression could be either, the impressions that we make of it or the one that the artist gives us. So I guess his point was the artist is always giving us that second impression, whether or not they're actively aware of it. So how do you feel about that, Diego? So you mentioned like you can have, the art without that artist's explanation of it.
I think an artist who's conscious of those things and conscious of the question coming afterwards, what did you mean by that? They might have a formalized answer, and maybe not. Some artists intentionally decline to do that. I think that the process is cathartic in general. I think there are two types of artists: the one that likes the idea of being an artist, and the one who is compulsed to be an artist. And those who are compulsed are doing it more because of a release of energy, of creative energy through a specific medium that they have found solves their problem. I think we all have that problem, by the way. We all, exert that energy in different ways. But I don't know if there has to be that necessarily. Like, it could just be a therapeutic process. I know, like, certain practices that I have that are very private, as far as like an art form, they are that for me, and I have no real interest in expressing, the formality around it, or there's no concept deeper than the thing that it is, and maybe the perfection of this form or that form. So I don't know if it's a necessary thing, and there is always something there, right, as far as what you're thinking about, and it is potentially informing the quality of the work that's being produced as well. I guess it's always there subconsciously. Whether or not it's important in the end to know that about the work, I don't necessarily think so.
Interesting.
Okay.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
And I think that's a pretty good place to close this off. So thank you both of you guys for joining me. I really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I learned a lot. I hope you guys feel the same way too. So Thank you everyone for tuning in. And I hope that you guys will join us for our next podcast episode. So thank you everyone and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. That was fun.